All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily. You should hopefully know me by now. And my term paper was about biodiversity versus ecosystem service conservation, effect of introduced pollinators on native pollinator species. So there are two kind of conservation ideologies that exist. And this is from a paper by Reyes et al. It was published in 2012. So you have the biodiversity side and the ecosystem services side. And biodiversity is more concerned on conservation for the sake of nature's intrinsic value. It's kind of that ecocentric, like the world is worth saving kind of viewpoint. It does focus on which things are most important to conserve, like which species are rarest, which species are most threatened, but it does focus more on just that things deserve to be conserved. Whereas with the ecosystem services perspective, it's more about the benefit to humans. So it's not always about what species are rarest or what species are most threatened, but which species contribute to food production, fiber production, and the resources that are anthropocentrically valued. So, of course, I love honeybees. I've loved honeybees for my whole life. I write all the time about them, and that's what I'm studying. So I wanted to talk about the white man's fly, as they came to be known in America. So when I say honeybee, I mean the European or the Western honeybee, Apis mellifera. Although there are other kinds of honeybees out there, that's my primary focus. They were introduced to the Americas in the 1600s. They came over with a lot of the early English settlers and were used as pollination, but also mostly for wax production and honey production. Since then, they've become a linchpin of the global agricultural system, and it's estimated that 1 in every 3 bites of food you take is pollinated by a honeybee or another kind of natural pollinator. And so the term the white man's fly is just a fun history tidbit, but it comes from the Native Americans. When the hives that the English brought over would swarm, the Native Americans would see like an advancing front of feral bees, and so they came to be known as the white man's fly. So there's your history lesson for today, and now we'll get back to the science lesson. So plant pollinator interactions are something we studied quite a bit in this class. We had those guest lecturers come in and talk about it. But it's just a very, very large scale mutualism. There's all kinds of different levels of specialization and selectivity that we see in different species and different organisms and different families. So it can be very complex, but it can also kind of be summed up in Sargent and Otto's theory about pollination syndrome, where there are adaptations on both the plant side and the insect side, but ideally a plant wants to be pollinated by the pollinator who's most efficient and most effective and is the best pollinator for the plant's fitness overall. And so we really picture honeybees as pollinator prodigies, and research shows that while they are good and they do have conveniences for us, like our ability to ship them around the country through migratory beekeeping, they're not always the best pollinator for the job. I've got a little quote by C.K. Springle down there. Darwin later echoed it, but it just sums it up that nature wants flowers to be cross-pollinated. And so that's why bees and other pollinators are so incredibly important, because they really enable that sharing of genetics within plant communities. So these are some examples of competition between native and exotic pollinators that I found doing my research on the paper. You've got honeybees and California bumblebees. You've got honeybees and Hawaiian yellow-faced bees, honeybees and Mexican coffee plantations, and then honeybees and the existing pollinator networks and how they influence that. And so with the bumblebees, this was a study done. It had a strong negative relationship between the honeybee density and the bumblebee density in subsequent years. And the research really found that when the honeybee and the bumblebee, when conditions did not allow the bumblebee to prevent diet overlap, that was when their population density suffered the greatest. The Hawaiian yellow-faced bee, that was an interesting one as well, because H. anthracinius is that bee there, and the honeybee actually temporally displaced it. So the Hawaiian bee didn't feed during peak honeybee feeding times, and it also had shorter feeding times after a honeybee had fed first. So that was something interesting to see, that not only was it like a temporal displacement, but it was almost a little bit spatial. And then honeybees and Mexican coffee, of course, we add honeybees into systems because we want to boost production and boost yield. And the study found that not only did the introduction of honeybees decrease diversity of native pollinators and decrease the species richness, it also actually decreased fruit set. And so it harmed yields. And so that's definitely not something we often consider when we add honeybees into a system, but it's a good stopping, like a reminder that honeybees aren't always the best for the jobs. And then the honeybees versus existing pollinator networks, that was a paper that a couple of WSU researchers were also on, and it showed an application of Sargent and Otto's pollinator syndrome, that plants who have a wild pollinator mutualist then get involved with honeybees. If the honeybees outperform and outcompete, the plant will slowly adapt traits that are more attractive to the honeybee than to its normal native mutualist. So there's a lot of different ways that competition affects and that competition manifests, but the effects, while varied, are all pretty explanatory that, the honeybee might not be the best one for the job. And so one thing that we can do, modern agriculture has completely blown the honeybee out of proportion. Without the honeybee, agriculture would almost cease if you try to remove it from our production systems today. So it is incredibly important that we preserve and protect the honeybee, but we also need to be doing more to protect native bees. And there's a lot of different people involved in this, in these issues. Landowners don't really like to be told what to do with their land, but they want to make economical choices, of course. Biologists, especially conservation biologists, they want to save species and protect our environment. And then beekeepers are kind of stuck in the middle. They have to have acreage so that their bees can forage and build up for wintertime, and so that they can produce honey to feed their hives and also make a profit. But they also have that economic issue where they need to be able to make a living. So there's a lot of different issues involved, a lot of different complex characters. But one solution that has come up is this apiary influence range that Henry and Rodet constructed. So with this graphic, each triangle is like an apiary, which is a grouping of hives, basically. And in the past, it's been density dependent. So it's just that you can only have so many hives in one space. But Rodet and Henry, they're shifting the paradigm to the space around the apiary. And so the apiary influence range is the distance where competition is influenced. So there's increased competition with native pollinators in the darkest red, and then it lessens as it goes out. So instead of placing high density colonies in small patches of area, if you take those apiaries and you spread them out amongst a conservation area, there's less harm done to native pollinators, and in some cases there's less harm done to the individual colonies because you have less disease and pest transfer. So ideally, biodiversity conservation and ecosystem service conservation are not two conflicting ideas. They're not even really a Venn diagram where they're two ideas that overlap. we could potentially think of them as a big circle. We just have to shift the way that we consider what is worth conserving and how we can shift our agricultural products so that they rely more on preserving native ecosystems while still producing great enough amounts of food that we can feed the 9 billion people we're projected to have in 2050. So of course, it's always a delicate balancing act. There's so many complications. There's a lot of context dependency, but if we begin to shape the way we think about these and change our frameworks, so much can be done to conserve our natural environments while still having important agricultural production levels. And that is what I have to say. Thank you for listening.
Great.